Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1172nd New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Widline Cadet, Pao Houa, Farah Al Qasimi, and Chloe Stagaman. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Farah Al Qasimi makes photographs, films, and music, often working with large-scale vinyl imagery and multiplicity of photographic prints and screens. She is interested in the internet and its hierarchies of information and emotion. Widline Cadet is a visual artist based in Los Angeles whose practice is rooted in photography and includes video, sound, sculpture, performance, and installation. Her work centers her family's lived experience of immigrating from Haiti to the United States as source material to explore the complexities of Black diasporic life and survival. Pao Houa is a Hmong American artist whose practice engages primarily with legacies and potentials of landscape, portraiture, and documentary photographic traditions and aesthetics, creating works that examine identity, longing, and belonging in Hmong diasporic communities. Chloe Stagaman and our host today. Chloe Stagaman is a Brooklyn-based writer and curator. She is the director of programs at the Brooklyn Rail, where she works on the journal's weekday conversation series, The New Social Environment. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chloe to get us started.
Thank you so much, Min, and thank you as ever to you and Magli who lend your brilliance to this program every weekday and make it the space that it is. And thank you to the team at the Rail, and thank you most of all to Pa, Fada, and Widline for your work. It's been such an honor to do a close look at it through this exhibition. For those of you who haven't seen this show, that's the subject of today's conversation. It's called Traces of Us, Recent Photography, and it's at Peter Bloom Gallery in Manhattan in New York until March 22nd. You must go see it. We're going to look at digital reproductions, but all of the artists in the show pay such careful attention to space and such careful attention to viewership and the experience of being in the gallery. And it really is just rife with really interesting juxtapositions. And I really encourage you to go see it. It also includes work by John Edmonds and Guadalupe Rosales, who couldn't be here today, but who are in the show and have amazing works in the show. So we're going to start by walking through the photographs in the show as they appear with each of the artists who are here today. But before we do that, I want to just say hello, Fada, Pa, and Widline. It's so great to be in this space with you.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Okay, so I'm going to share screen so that you can see this image. Can everyone see? Okay, great. So Pa, this is the first image that we see when we come into Peter Bloom Gallery, and it's one of 7 images in the show, all of which are part of a series of yours called The Imaginative Landscape that you took between 2018 and 2020. And I have to admit that when I was researching for this exhibition, at one point I miswrote the title of the series. I called it The Imagined Landscape. When I went back to fix that error, I grew so fond of your choice of imaginative because of the emphasis it puts on landscape itself as this thing that's evolving and sort of cultivating creativity, and how you as a photographer are as much a part of your landscape as you are, looking at it. And so I wonder if you can talk about how landscape functions in your practice, and especially in the series that's on view right now in Peter Bloom.
Yeah. So first and foremost, thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor when I'm given a platform to talk about my practice and my work, and and especially to be able to share like a platform with other artists who I love and admire. So first and foremost, thank you. So the imaginative landscape is a term that was coined by a scholar, Valerie Flink, who looked at Christopher Columbus, his mindset before he sailed the ocean to discover new worlds, and essentially she described his mindset as having this imaginative landscape where he wasn't really thinking about the realities of the world in which he was living in. He was actually basing this new reality on books that he's read, tells that he's heard from sailors, paintings that he's seen, drawings that he's seen about this new world. And it is through this imagination, this imaginative landscape, that he realizes that the world that he discovered is absolutely nothing like the world that he imagined, right? And so for me, I was really thinking about like the stories that my grandmother had told me about Laos, and I had never gone to Laos before 2012. Even though I was born in Laos, I don't have a lot of memories of Laos. Actually, I don't have any memories of Laos, and so what I had imagined Laos to be through the stories of my grandmother was quite different from the Laos that I had discovered in 2012. I feel like for me, this body of work is like very much like a research. I'm going in and I'm looking at the landscapes, and it is very much the sort of shifting landscape. I want to also note too that like all the works aren't made in Laos. There's some landscapes that are in the United States. For instance, this image that we're looking at is an image that was made in northern Minnesota. Um, and um, and so there's this so I'm really thinking about, yeah, what could what could Laos be like for me? What could it look like? What could it have? And then really thinking about like photography, like the research that I've done in looking at like photography that's made in Laos, and then specifically portraiture that's made in Laos, and really thinking about these like I call it the iconography image that is very much of Laos, of Hmong people, that continues to pop up again and again. And for me, it is the poppy, it's the opium flower. And so this image pops up again and again, like throughout the work. Yeah, it's like the image signifies for me a time when Hmong people were prosperous. Oftentimes Hmong elders talk about wanting to go back to Laos. It is not Laos like the country, but it is like a time where Hmong people had autonomy over themselves. And this was a period from like the 1940s to 1960s when Hmong folks were growing and selling opium to China and to the Laos government, and when they had money. And so the opium, or the poppy flower, it pops up again and again, and it's this sort of repetitive image or flower that can be seen throughout the body of work.
Yeah, and that's such a good segue to my next question, which was about the poppy and thinking about the different forms it takes in your work, because it becomes a really interesting device to think about installation, to think about rooting your photographs within a broader conceptual framework and story each time. And your work really resists a singular chronology, and that's something that we'll come back to throughout today's conversation. Like the poppy kind of is always ever present and almost a refrain throughout your projects, but then allows for, like, there's always a different mixture of your photographs sort of portrayed. Like I brought together this image where you had a plot of poppies in the center of the gallery. Also, the cover of your recent monograph with Aperture had an AI generated poppy cover, so these poppies sort of recur, and so I wonder if you can expand a bit more on that recurrence. Is it something that it's just recurring naturally, or is it something that you keep returning to, maybe for a specific purpose in the work conceptually?
Yeah, so back in 2015, 2016, I went to this uh, symposium where there was a Vietnamese American scholar who talked about the Asian American like aesthetic. And more importantly, like what is the Asian American, Southeast Asian American iconography? And so I started really thinking about what is the Hmong like aesthetic, what is the Hmong iconography, and I keep on coming back to the opium flower, the poppy flower. That is the thing that I think for me represents like the Hmong identity. It isn't so much about like the American War, which is also really important too, but it is about the flower, this very singular poppy flower, right? That and it's a very specific type of flower, right? And it represent there's a representation in there for us. It's for Hmong people, it's a time when we were prosperous. It's the first time in history where we were able to make money, where we had money, where the Laos government was, like in some sort of like fear for of us because we had economic power. And so Hmong people oftentimes, our community, and especially like our elders, like they often reference this time of the like this period when they were cultivating poppy as like a time of like great wealth and great prosperity. And when they talk about going back to Laos, they often refer to this very specific period. um and so I've heard a lot of stories about what it was like to be in Laos during that time. My grandmother, who I had a really great, my maternal grandmother, who I had a really great relationship with, and before she passed, she would tell me these like really beautiful stories about Laos and about that time and about just the kind of energy that existed during that time, right before the war. And yeah, so I often think when I think about the poppy, I'm like thinking about this time. And for me, it is very deliberate, to think about the poppy as a singular floral, but then also as this sort of field, this valley of like hope and resiliency. And I see it pop up in other forms too, especially thinking about like the marijuana farming that exists in Northern California or in Southern California or in Oklahoma. And it's the same sort of story. The only difference is that the crop has changed, like as the crop has changed. And so it comes up very deliberately in my work.
Yeah, you really see it. And I know when you did a window installation for MoMA, it had the poppies as well. And I can imagine what it was like to like be in the urban realm of Midtown Manhattan and kind of
Mm.
poppies along the window. So they really become this way of invoking that resiliency in different landscapes. And I know that it's interesting because the rest of the photographs from the series that are on view at Peter Bloom are portrait orientation, but sort of
Mm.
form a landscape in their collectivity. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the tradition of studio photography that you work within, and its own, in the case of this series, its own considerations of landscape. You've touched on this a little bit, but often these studio photographs feature paintings of landscapes in the
Mhm.
background, botanicals that are made with cloth that won't fade in color. And this process of taking these photographs feels very social. It feels like something that you're doing very much in conversation with the people who you're photographing. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that process and inspirations that you had when you started to expand upon this practice over time, because you've done studio portraiture like this for a while.
Yeah. So I think also like this goes back to this history with Hmong people too, right? And so when the French colonized Laos in the 1900s, with the colonization of Laos, they brought studio portraiture to Laos, and so you start seeing that in the 1900s, and it the way in which it has evolved over time would be, so so the French would come and they would have these painted moundscapes, and then there would be these black and white images that were made. And throughout history and throughout time, Laos, the people of Laos, and then also Hmong people in general, started to incorporate their own elements, right? And so for Southeast Asia, and specifically in Laos, silk florals or plastic florals are huge, really big. You see more plastic floral shops than floral shops itself. And so there is this sort of incorporation of the plastic florals, either as backdrops, either as florals that anchor the sitter. You start to see that. And I love looking at old studio portraiture, and then really for me, really dissecting the image itself, right? So the backdrop, the florals on the sides, and then the sitter, like those things. I feel like in the imagined landscape, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to really think about them individually, and then bringing them together collectively. And I feel like that's what the imagined landscape for me is. And so, and when I'm thinking about portraiture, I'm thinking about this history that Hmong people have with portraiture, where it comes from, how it gets made, how it's continued to be made in this day and age too. And so the style of portraiture for Southeast Asians, for Hmong people, is still very relevant in our community. You go to a Hmong New Year and you go and get your portrait taken, and it's a mountainscape in the background, and it's fake florals either in front of you or on the side, and they are there to anchor you in. And it's this continued way of making images, and really for me trying to figure out like where that came from, and how do I, as a photographer, how do I dissect that, and how do I like learn from that? So
I want to come back to so many of these things in the latter half of our conversation, but for time, I'm going to move to Farah. Farah, you have 5 photographs in this exhibition, and they've previously been exhibited as different exhibitions that have sort of a narrative element and tie to the exhibition focus. And I was reading about your process and your work, and one of the things that I've noted, and I'm curious what you think of this, but I feel like you're constantly looking as a photographer and seeing as your photographs are evidence of a constant photographic practice of looking at the world, engaging with it. And then the exhibition of the photograph becomes a way, in your own words, of creating constellations of narrative worlds that are in service to one another. So the narrative becomes this really interesting way to engage what you've seen over time, to kind of avoid a certain chronology to the work and to revisit it and think about it in different groupings. And so to give our audience an example of that, like 3 of these photographs were part of an exhibition called Surge that revisited The Little Mermaid, and not the Disney World one. This Little Mermaid ends with the mermaid killing herself because the prince won't won't be with her, really, really dark times. I actually didn't realize.
It's the original Hans Christian Andersen.
Yeah.
So it's not, I didn't make up the morbid ending.
Oh, no, 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 totally. No, it's the original Little
Yeah.
Mermaid.
Yeah.
But it became this way to talk about so many different things and contemporary issues around climate, around coast, around how in rejecting the planet, we're also rejecting our own health and care for ourselves. And so I wonder if you can talk about that process as a photographer of looking in the first instance and then constantly revisiting an archive and associating narratives towards an end and towards an exploration in your practice.
Yeah. I guess I really think about photographing or looking as like a life project where I try not to be so precious about setting up the perfect conditions to make a photograph happen, but instead to sort of let go of the reins a little bit and just be somebody who's always curious or observing particular things that I'm kind of instinctually pulled towards. But for Surge, I had been radically changing the way that I worked because a lot of this work was made during the pandemic, during lockdown. And so I was limited to really specific settings where, normally the work that I made was in domestic spaces with people that I knew really well. Suddenly you couldn't really be outside. You can be inside with people in the same way and, having these kind of intimate get-togethers. So I would go on these long walks around Abu Dhabi where I was raised and just kind of, spend some time by the water, spend some time in the city, which is right on the water. And I started becoming really interesting in the way that water functioned in a kind of coastal urban environment that really needs fresh water to function, but doesn't have an abundance of it. So for a previous commission, I had worked on photographing these salt lakes that were forming inland in the Emirates, but they're kind of a thing that occurs really all around the world. But in this specific instance, they were a result of the massive desalination project that the country runs on in order to create fresh water for its residents and businesses and just kind of everything, the entire infrastructure. So there's this problem now where we have all of this excess brine or salt because the ocean water gets debrined and then used, whatever is considered fresh or potable is put into the water system, and then what the leftover salt gets either dumped back into the coastline or gets kind of put into these lakes that are forming. So this was one of the lakes that I visited, and you can see that it crystallizes and it kills everything in its path. So that little critter that you see was a locust at one point. And the reason why I kind of brought The Little Mermaid into it was just a personal reference because I grew up with the first animation of it, which was an anime that was made in 1975. And it was so deeply sad, so I could not believe that it was made for innocent little children. But there was something about loss and choice in that felt really important, to bring into that research so that it wasn't just, becoming interested in something and kind of pursuing it from an anthropological or a kind of informative perspective, but also having this moment where I'm weaving it into something cultural that was important for my value building as a young person. So I started to think a little bit more, intentionally about these narratives of growth and loss and what gets transformed by desire, both on a kind of like a personal level, but also an environmental level. And I was also thinking about the act of photographing things as kind of preserving them in the way that the salt will preserve that locust forever. So there was something that felt like it really lent itself to the medium well. I think I'm trying to think of the other photographs that are in there, but there's a lot of the time when I make these exhibitions that are, kind of narrative driven, there's also a moving image portion that ties some of the photographs together. And so in this image, I was thinking of the figure that you don't see as like, the Little Mermaid. And then there's a wallpaper that has a man in it, and he's really the only male figure in that entire series. Um, Oh, actually, this is a good one to talk about too, because this image on the right, even though you can't see it, that was taken at one of the salt lakes that people go to visit just to see. It's kind of a really bluish, um, it almost looks like a swimming pool. It's so incredibly blue, but you have to drive out into the desert to get there. And these three young women had gotten dressed to go to a nice dinner, and they were wearing these perfect pastels. And so I asked to photograph them, but they felt like sirens to me. So all of these different things started becoming really clear as analogies to the world that I was trying to build and add fiction to, even though it was rooted in a certain reality.
I love how throughout these photographs, this is just to give you all a sense of what an installation looks like typically from Farah. Like this is a current installation that's on at Tate and Tate Modern in London, and where the photographs become as much a wallpaper as they are installed in the space. But I want to get back to the photographs because I think a lot about how you were sort of stuck in place during that time in an unanticipated way. And several of these photographs, whether intentionally or not, really signal beyond their composition. Like in this one, you're looking at this window, but it's not there. Or in this one, the foot is in such a state of suspension, and I found myself so curious about the body hanging above the composition, like who's there. There's all of these indications of the world beyond the composition. And I wonder how you consider your framing when you're out photographing, and how you come to some of these quite sculptural at times compositions.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, apart from my style being informed by being someone who hates being photographed, I actually think that it goes back to something that Pa said. I think, Pa, you were mentioning that Laos was colonized by the French, and that they brought a lot of they brought the tradition of studio photography there. And the area that I come from, so I'm from Ras Al Khaimah, which is the north of the UAE, and from Lebanon. And the UAE was a British protectorate until 1971. And so photography was brought there by British military agents. And some of them even were given the roles of explorers. So it was their job to make contact with the tribes and, get in their good graces so that they could then do these ethnographic studies and take these portraits of them where they're kind of just like standing with their scepters or like, feeding their camels or whatever. So when I was growing up, that was really our only visual reference because that arrived so late. And there were other photographers who were brought on as part of the state building project in the 1970s and 1980s. Notable one who was from India, and then another photographer who was from Japan, but nobody who was actually from any of the original tribes. And so the whole visual history, the history of portraiture in that area is made up of people who are not from there. And so I think when I started working, I was really conscious of that and trying to pull away from this idea that in order to make a good portrait, you need a certain kind of visual clarity, and a kind of formula for how a person should be seen or how they should be represented. And I was also working with the very real challenge of a lot of the women in my community not wanting to have their faces shown, where they were open to being photographed, but they wanted to remain anonymous. And I didn't think that those two things had to be separate. I think that there was a way to work around it and have them either turned away from the camera or be able to sort of warp their bodies in other ways, where you're still letting the viewer in on a moment, and you're inviting them into a space with its own particular, social structure. And it's not about me being the person to kind of unlock that door for you, but instead preserving what's already there, and kind of keeping it at a level where everybody involved feels well represented. And actually, maybe the photograph of the person's eye in the mirror is a more recent example of that. But that was taken in Dearborn, Michigan, which is a place that I go to a lot. And that's my friend Miriam's eye. And she was just sitting around the table with her aunt and cousin, and they were having this intimate conversation. But I was more interested in this kind of naturally funny moment, unplanned moment of her eye in the magnifying side of the mirror being distorted and reflective than I was of like having this, kind of zoomed out photograph of women at the table talking about, some sort of family drama. To me, like the humor kind of brings you in and makes you feel like you are there observing things rather than kind of outside, and you're being told that like what is happening is important in some way.
Before I move to Widline, I'm curious how you think about scale in these compositions, because, as I was walking through, a friend of mine who's a photographer, we stopped here and we were like, is that life scale? In the print, we were sitting with it for a while, deciding between us. But how are you thinking about scale relative to what you're seeing? And just to respond to what you said, I feel like the anonymity lends a certain intimacy to the photographs, because there's so much detail presented to you across the composition, even though there's not a complete picture of a person always. There's this great intimacy. I mean, even with this one, I spent so much time looking at those feet. I mean, they give you so much information. So I wonder if you can talk about scale and intimacy, and then we'll move on.
Scale is something I'm still figuring out. I think I like to play with it a lot, and this is actually more of a conservative install for me because things are. I've been trying to play with having images be in these friezes where they're all hung in the same height, and it gives the opportunity to kind of treat them as building blocks where the narrative can change based on the formal relationships from piece to piece, and I think it starts to activate the edges a little bit more. But more recently, I'm playing with making things really, really tiny and actually also removing aspects of the image to really just give you a sliver of what you're looking at. But I generally think for me, it's not a bigger is better. I think that there's a pressure on a lot of photographers to make things that feel like monumental because, somehow we have to be treated the way that painters are treated or sculptors are treated, but I think, especially when you're showing in spaces that are very fine art driven, I think, it's more often than not, you'll see works of art that are huge, that demand your attention in a certain way, and like implicate you as a viewer. But for me, I try to think about the sweet spot in between having a work invite you in, but also making you do a little bit of practice as a looker to seek things out that won't be immediately obvious on first look, like the way that the girl in the corner has her hands crossed, or the tiny little sideburn on the left. I think that those are things that you have to get a little bit closer to really see.
Completely. Widline, you have 4 works on view in the exhibition. 2 of them have sculptural elements, kind of obstructing the image. I want to talk first about night photography. This is something that you started doing in the last couple of years, and I'm curious what spawned it and what it's arrived to for you creatively in terms of photographing at night.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Chloe. Yeah, I started photographing at night, which I don't think was a thing for me up until then. Randomly enough, I would usually shoot during the day or around like sundown. But I moved to LA maybe like 2.5 years ago. And so I think that sort of like had a big effect on my practice in different ways, where I was trying to be more experimental, but I also had, I don't know, this desire to be a little bit more messy and less clear in the ways that I like make images. And so thinking about ways that like I can play around with visibility with an image, framing, or have like these sort of like interactions at night. But also the thing that like spawned it was that I was thinking about this lore that I grew up with about like sort of like this creature when I was a kid. My parents used to talk about like this Lugao creature in Haiti where like all these bad things happen at night. They come at night and they wreak havoc at night. And so one of the things they would do is just like you have to be in bed early so like you're not like encountering these creatures. And so I was thinking more so not necessarily about the thing itself, but more so like my relationship to, I don't know, this thing, this idea that I grew up with in Haiti, but then like that's traveled with me over the years and over like geographic distance to the US and how I am now processing these things as an adult, but also as an artist. And so through like this interest, I like started thinking about like photographing at night and ways of like trying to figure out my relationship to night based on like these things, these lores that I grew up with, but also um, ways of like obscuring things in my images, ways of like thinking about memory in a way where not everything has to be clear. Um, in terms of the more sculptural elements, I was thinking about these breeze block designs that are a part of the house that I grew up in Haiti. I don't remember the structure of the house per se. I don't remember how many rooms were in the house. I don't remember much of the details, but I do remember this idea of like these breeze blocks. I took photos of them the last time I was in Haiti, and so this architectural element has just always stayed with me in these different ways and has been like this interest of mine in terms of like my practice for the longest. And so I've been trying to figure out ways of incorporating that into an actual photograph. And so I got to the point where I wanted to design the breeze blocks. And part of it is having them as like sort of like a container. A lot of my work thinks about ways of like photographing things I don't have access to or photographing absence, or photographing things that aren't necessarily physically tangible in a lot of ways. So part of it for me was thinking about ways I can make that visible, or I can like photograph that lack in a way, or ways that I can like image that lack of things being tangible, that lack of things being like solid and like clear in a way. And so having the breeze blocks lay over this kind of like these different images that like you have to really look in, and even when you look in, you don't necessarily see the full image. You just see like little parts of it peek out. So yeah.
I love that. And I love thinking about how there's these two pairs of images. There's the images with the sculptural element, which really feel like they're looking out at the night, kind of yearning to be out there a little bit, like
Mhm.
curious, and invoking a window, invoking, I spent a lot of time looking at these and kind of thinking about what's behind them and thinking about the act of being able to see through a fence and being like, I so badly want to go over there. But then there are also the photographs of your subjects. And I put this in here just to show audiences that these spatial considerations and sculptural considerations of the photographs didn't really begin with this series. I mean, that's something that you've always kind of thought about. This is at the Studio Museum where you had a work that took over a corner of the gallery. But then the photographs outside have a certain celebratory quality of being out at night in this space. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about these singular individuals in the photographs and about the landscape of Los Angeles relative to the portraits and how you found this place and also its significance within the photographs for you.
Sure. It's kind of weird because I've been photographing in LA for years, even before I moved here. But I started photographing here because so much of the landscape is so tropical. It reminds me of the Caribbean. But also, I've been photographing in this specific spot for maybe like 5 years now, if not longer. And so there's this image, the image that's under this is black, and then the previous image were all taken at the same place, but you wouldn't necessarily know it because the landscape has changed so much. And this during the seasons has changed, and it's basically a public park, but then they're like constantly changing it. But also, I just forgot the second part of your question, Chloe.
I guess I'm just curious how you found this location where you're photographing. I believe it's a park in Los Angeles that you've been going to for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes, it's a park. I shoot at multiple parks, but this one specifically is Angels Gate Park. It's in the San Pedro area. I used to do an internship there when I visited LA when I was in grad school. And so that like sparked my interest in living in LA, but also in making work there. And that was probably the beginning of me wanting to come here to make work, but also to live here as an artist as well. Um, and then in terms of the figures, there is this sense of like, I think just thinking about like my relationship to night and all of these like things that I grew up with, for me, I think in photographing these figures at night, I felt like, I don't know, there's a sense of like wanting to show magic, wanting to show like reverence, wanting to show like I don't know, this secret life or like this alternative landscape, this alternative world that is a part of like having these characters there in the night and having them stare back at you and having them be so comfortable, but also so present and taking up space in this very unsure landscape at times.
There's also this feeling of never quite seeing the whole composition. Like it could be my height, but when I was encountering the printed object, the branch above this person and the image never quite fully appeared visually, but it was suggested sort of in the shadows and the light on the print. And it's so magical in person. Like you have to see this work in person because it's really it is like lending so much mystery to landscape. And I wonder how that mystery serves the work for you in terms of creating a possibility within the ambiguity of the landscape that has to do with your own memory and also how your work is approaching memory.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. It's absolutely related to memory. And I think after listening to Pi, I appreciate the way she described I don't know that her relationship to memory as well. And so I think part of it for me has been like not necessarily being sure if my memories are correct or if they're not, I guess, yeah, if they're just like my impression, looking back. Uh, and so part of the excitement in photographing at night is just like having this image that sort of like slowly reveals itself or not. And being unsure of like where you are, or when you are a lot of the times. There is also this element of time that I'm interested in. And so having all of those things come into like an image and playing different roles at times.
I want to give Pa and Farah a chance to reflect a little bit on this image together. Um, I just from my own experience spending time with it, the direct gaze was so arresting, like in the gallery space. I was immediately drawn to the image, Widline, and I really the way that the branch is positioned, it just constantly arrives and it really encourages a slow, sort of deliberate vantage point on the image. And I'm curious how cadence is considered with this image as well, like how much you're thinking about slowing the viewer down and creating a longer view on the image. You know, we live in this time where it's just constant image inundation. And there was something really beautiful and poignant and satisfying about the way this image really slowly reveals itself, just in printed form.
Mhm. That's, I love that. Uh, but definitely, I like to have people move around in an image, even if it's just whether it's big or small. I like the idea of having you move around. Because when you look, one of the nice things about like having a print in physical form is that like you get to see the textures, the way the ink sits on specific types of paper and things like that. And so one of the things I really appreciate about seeing this one in print format is just like depending on where you're looking at it, you can see the branch glowing, or you can see like the way the ink just looks and shimmers. So like whether you're looking at it from below or from above or from the side as well, different things become visible. And I like this idea of having people exercise while looking at the work in different vantage points.
Hi.
I love this image, and I kind of agree with what Chloe said about it. And I think for me, as somebody who doesn't make straightforward portraiture, like this to me really communicates um what I do love about straightforward portraiture, which is that, when I say straightforward, I mean person kind of meeting your gaze, but there's something happening here that is so it is arresting. Like they're really meeting our gaze. And it makes me think about how challenging of an image this must have been to make, because it is it doesn't seem like an image that you made in a split second. It's very clearly, it's carefully made. The light is really painterly and directional, so it makes me think of a Vermeer or something. It's like really um soft and kind of intentional. Um, so this person wasn't caught off guard, but I think it can be really hard to also walk that line between getting something human and unguarded, and also, making something that um, is planned or posed. So it just feels like they're even within the control that you had, it feels like there's a moment happening. And that's kind of what pulled me into this one. And what I really appreciated about seeing it in the gallery was that it felt like there was a genuine connection. And it wasn't like an overly staged portrait, that there was still something about this person that you managed to um, show us, that you couldn't have planned.
Thank you.
I was gonna say too that I love photography for like for a lot of reasons, but I love that like photography allows us to it allows us to do so many things, and the idea of magic and illusion is something that I think a lot about in my work. um, and then also like this sort of the way in which photographs are installed and the installation of a set of images, and then also like really thinking about like the viewer and the dance that the viewer has to do, this sort of in and out that comes into when the viewers are are looking and are examining like an image. And Chloe, I love that you like I love that you like you talked about this image and how you couldn't see the branches on top because you weren't you just couldn't see the branches on top. So there's just things like that that I really love about photography. And then also going back to what Farah was saying about like scale too, right? Like there's a way in which like the scale of an image can completely immerse us into the image, and then also the size of the image can either bring us in and lean us in to look and to study the image a bit longer. And then so I really like the way in which yeah, like the my two amazing artist colleagues are thinking about photography and are like playing with, maybe not playing because playing isn't the right word, but the way in which you're handling the images that you're making, whether it is whether or not you're creating a story a space, an experience. Like I just like yeah, there's so many wonderful things that are happening in this exhibition that I'm just completely in love with, and I think really does talk about like the essence of like photography. And so
That's a good segue to another wonderful image in the exhibition. I want to talk about this photograph together. This photograph is so mysterious to me, Farah. I can't figure out where you took it. The shadow up top is so perplexing to me. And in its simplicity, it speaks volumes about, the history of photography, iconography, and also, thinking about it as a part of a series that you attached to the idea of the poltergeist or horror stories. It took on this element to me of like a seance. But I'm curious how you came to this photo. Was this something you encountered? Was it a something you made? And then also, yeah, how you think about this photograph relative to some of the narratives that you've been exploring in recent years.
I think Pao mentioned the magic of photography, and I feel like sometimes that magic is that the world will offer things up to you that are weirder than you could ever plan yourself. And I think for this image, in terms of how it was made, really straightforward. Like even so straightforward that I was like, is this anything? Should I show it? Because I'm used to like intervening so much more in what it is that I'm doing. But basically, what you're saying is, um, it's photographed. It's on the ground at our house in the Emirates during my lockdown. These are wishbones that my mother saved from roast chickens over the course of a year for my nieces and nephews to break, because that tradition where you break two people will break a wishbone from a chicken, and whoever gets the bigger piece gets to make a wish that comes true. Um, and of course, my mother always lets the little ones win. Um, At the same time, you also see this is a piece of lace that we've had at our house that I think was used as like a just like a doily to put picture frames on. But if you look closely at the image, it's a little bit hard to see it in this. But if you look towards the right, you can see a tear that has very carefully been hand sewn back together. And I don't know, to me, this that I found the Ziploc. I found these two things separately because I was making cyanotypes of the lace. But I wanted to just place the wishbones on top of the lace in my workspace outside where I was making these cyanotypes. Because to me, they're just two items that are really indicative of a kind of care that's not always obvious. But it's not the kind of mother's love that you would see in a Valentine's card or like a children's cartoon, but it's a kind of love and care that you have to look a little bit more attentively to see. And yeah, so for me, this is really kind of a portrait of my mother in a way.
mm,
And she hates to be photographed. There's almost no photographs of her exist. So yeah, so I don't know that I know it's mysterious, but for me, like if you're somebody who knows the wishbone thing, then you'll see it as that. But for people who don't, I think they go a little bit towards the like gore or horror. But to me, it is really about care. And I've been a vegetarian for 12 years, so it was gross for me to to do this. But yeah, and I think it's the flatness is also because the sun is completely overhead. And so the lighting of it almost makes it look like it's a scan of it. But yeah, that's just available light.
Widline, I want to give you a chance to jump in. I can also jump in if.
No, I think one of the things I always appreciate is I think the ways that like Farah like builds meaning to her images. And part of one of the things I appreciate about hearing you speak about this is like there is like this internal meaning that feels like this is for me. But then there's also this way of like having this image where I think it's very beautiful and also sensitive. I didn't go towards the gore aspect. I think the way that it's photographed feels very much like this is important. You may not know why necessarily, but this feels important. Look at this and look at how I'm photographing it in a way that feels very, I don't know, caring, very cared for, very nurtured for. And so I think I've always appreciated that about your practice. And this is probably my favorite image in the show. And it's like, I don't know, the details.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I love that this is a portrait of your mother. Yeah, I mean, just everything, you know, the wishbones and the Doyle and that frame. I mean, there's so much. And I think, I mean, going back to this, the question of, or the idea of like looking and having a longer investigation, right? And just not passing through images and really looking at the images. I mean, this is a really great example of that. So.
Thank you, guys.
I want to talk about this photograph. It's one of the larger portrait orientation photographs in the show. It's so dramatic, like has such a presence in the gallery. And I was struck by your use of black and white while depicting glass oranges. I can only imagine how vibrant their orange is. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about finding this still life in space and what that was like, and incorporating this work into the series.
Yeah, so I think like for me, it's important to talk about the use of black and white and color photography and how I use them interchangeably. So for me, when I think about black and white photography, I'm thinking about a history, a past, and photography. Color photography for me is of the now, right? And so when I use photography, when I use color photography and black and white photography, I'm oftentimes referencing a past, a history in the black and white, and then the color photography works are of the now, the present, the future, right? And also, this, if you've ever been to like a Southeast Asian like restaurant, you will undoubtedly find yourself in the midst of um, silk florals, fake florals everywhere you go. And so these fake oranges were at they were at a faux place here in Minneapolis, and I went and I it was this tree and this other tree that I photographed together. And so I just like I went and I had my camera with me and a flash, and asked the owner if I could like make these photographs, and she said of course, and I did. And they sat with me for a while, as images often do. And I just, one night, seeing these photographs and seeing this sort of the flash, and really thinking about, I am always thinking about studio portraiture, Hmong studio portraiture, and yeah, like really like seeing how these can be very much a part of these like fake florals that I like have encountered so many times in the past, and wanted to represent it in this way. So that's what they are. I mean, I wish there was something. I mean, I wish the story was a lot more interesting than it is, but it is really much just taking your camera with you and seeing things out in the world, and like having a reference to something that you're doing, and asking, and making. So yeah.
I love this image for a lot of reasons, and it reminds me of a photograph that was in your MFA thesis show.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which we were talking before everybody came on the call about how I still have the publication that Paul made for her MFA thesis 13 years ago. So I've been a fan forever. But I think
Mhm.
what I love about this, to go back to Widleen's comment about how we make meaning, um, is that, deciding to make a monochromatic image today means a very different thing than it did in 1951. Especially when you're showing it alongside work that's in color. And this is something that I've been thinking about in my own work right now too. So for me, where I start to get meaning from this photograph, and I think this is where a lot of people don't want to do the work with photography, where there's an expectation that meaning should kind of be handed to you, where like we allow other mediums more room for interpretation or for opacity. But for me, I look at this and I think, of course, you're not going to just hand us the neon color of those glass oranges, and it to me, it's this exact um, not well, it's a very similar gesture to this problem of recreating an environment in a place where you physically can't access it.
Mhm.
Like my family who immigrated from Lebanon to Massachusetts will have all these like kind of over stylized pictures of Beirut where I'm like, come on, it doesn't look like that. It's not that nice. I mean so I think this thing of having the backgrounds where the flowers are even more colorful and saturated than they would be. It really speaks to a necessity of transformation that so many people have to go through in order to preserve their selfhood. Um, and I can get there because as somebody who's looking at that, I see that you've kind of limited my access
Mhm.
to like the thingness of the thing, and I feel like that's exciting to me about this photograph. Like it speaks to me on that level, and it's also the vertical blinds. Like so, I grew up with vertical blinds. I mean, I hate them so much, but like
Mhm.
that, seeing that and having that recognition, of like what kinds of spaces vertical blinds exist in. Yeah, I just think it really works on those levels for me.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the things I appreciate is just that it not necessarily be maybe about the thing itself, but I think maybe my relationship. I don't necessarily have this exact same tree, like, but I know that like my mom has like trinkets like that in her home or like in restaurants that I've been through, and just like having these little objects that I think feel somewhat universal across like diasporic experiences in ways that I'm like amazed by. We recognize it not necessarily as the thing, but as the gesture of what it means and symbolizes for its presence in whatever space it occupies.
Thank you all so much for those. I want to close us out. This has flown by. I could talk with the three of you forever about these photographs, but I want to end today with a question about language. And before I ask it, I want to encourage our audience to submit your questions at the link in the chat. There's a submission form. We're going to turn to Q&A after this, and we welcome any questions you may have. I'm curious about whether translation factors into your practice and how. And I know just from researching into this exhibition, like thinking about how you each are operating with certain fictions in mind. And I think that goes hand in hand with the consideration of um, as someone who's worked in translation myself, like that in between place of like the original and the translation and the space of possibility that exists between those two. And I think that that feels very relevant across all three of your bodies of work. And I'm curious how and if you think about translation when you're working on your photographs.
Yes. A lot, actually. I think of translations not necessarily just like in terms of like a language being translated. I feel like there's different layers of translation that happens when I'm making an image and when I'm like figuring out ways to title it, but also ways of like how it's going to be translated to the viewer as well and how much control I may or may not have over that. I guess maybe one of the first layers is like having to translate what I'm seeing in my head into like a physical thing into an actual piece or something like that. That's one layer of it. And then there's this other layer of like I don't know what it meaning that I'm trying to attach to it and whether or not I'm considering or I care if people get the same meaning that I'm getting. And so it's like part of it is trying to figure out what meaning that I'm like trying to assign to it. And if I'm expecting people to get the exact same thing and I'm not a lot of the times, I think for the most part, I'm okay with people not necessarily getting everything. And so there's like this letting go of my translation into whatever I'm making as well.
Mm.
But also thinking that like there's this all there's this space in between, I guess maybe I don't necessarily think that original is like the word that I would use. I don't know what word I would use, but like the thing in the beginning and then the thing when it reaches like another destination. And there's like the space of possibility for me feels like it lives in between like the ways that like translations sometimes fail or are impossible to certain things.
I think about translation a lot, and I think about it in my work, and I think about it in ways in which I've exhibited in other places. I also think about translation in the sense of like access, right? And so for instance, I've been making these videos, these gutsia, that's what they're called in Hmong. And, I've been asked whether or not I would like to have subtitles in the translation, right? So that they could be translated so that the viewer can have access to them. And I've had to really there's a part of me that wants everybody to have access so that then the translation is like really important. And then there's also like a huge part of me that says, I actually don't want translation and maybe a summary, but no translation. And if people really care enough about what they're listening to, they're gonna like find ways to go out into the world, and they're gonna find ways to, you know, do some Google research. And I think that oftentimes as artists of color, like, and as when we're making work and we're like putting it out into the world, there is like, I know for me there is a level of like needing it to be accessible for everybody. And so that's like for me, like the translation comes in, right? And thinking about like the work that I make, well, the work that I make is like very much about and for the Hmong community, but like I often am wondering, like, okay, well, how can I make it universal so that like everybody can access the work? And I think like that for me is like translation. And there's, I don't know if it's like old age. I don't know if it's being more confident in like the work that I'm making and saying, actually, we don't really need the translation. If I care enough about something, if I'm curious about the thing that I'm looking at, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna do my own research. And that, because I do that myself, the expectation is that, I would hope that anybody who comes and look at the work and wants to know more about the things that we're talking about or the things that we're photographing, the hope is that they're going to go out into the world and they're going to like they're going to be able to do their own research and can translate themselves, right? And so that's where I'm like landing in terms of thinking about language and like translation in like all aspect of like the work.
I guess I think about it visually a lot. I mean, I do translate my films. My last film, I had narrated in Arabic and then had English subtitles, because I was like, wait a minute, this has an Arab protagonist, and why is it in English? So I'm trying to be better about that, but I think about it on the level of, if you removed if you completely removed what was in the photograph, what are the things, in my own visual language that signal to me that this is one of my photographs? And I guess that also could be linked to style. But I spent 2 months in Marfa, Texas last year, doing a residency at the Chinati Foundation. And I made photographs. I was shocked. I thought I was just gonna like make a bunch of music and, maybe write some things and call it a day. But I made a lot of photographs, and the visual language that I was using was really strange to me because it was in dialogue with a very specific history that I had seen in that part of the world. So I'm thinking a lot about that, how that translates from context to context, especially because my work happens in so many different locations, and the meaning is really in how you're linking, each photograph to the other. And I haven't figured out, it's it's part of my questioning right now, but for the next thing that I'm working on, I've kind of selected 3 different locations, and I'm bringing together places that I often go. So I think that the question of translation will really come out as I do that.
Thank you all so much for this conversation, which has been such an honor to speak with you. It's been such an honor to speak with you three about your work. I'm going to pass it over to Min. I believe there are some audience questions.
Thank you. This was so fun to listen to. And Chloe, thank you for such thoughtful questions. Our first question is from Magley. Magley, you should be able to mute.
Hello, thank you all so much. This was so fun to listen in on, and I'm so excited to go see the show. I was very curious, Farah and Widline. I saw that you both, well, Farah, you make music, and Widline, you incorporate sound sculptures in your work. I just wanted to know about a little bit more about the sonic element of your work and how that interacts with the image making, if at all.
Great question. So far, the music that I've made has accompanied films, more specifically. So it's responding to a visual world that already exists. So for that Arabic film that I mentioned, it was a horror comedy about fog. So a lot of the music is kind of murky synthesizer, and it tries to echo some of the visual elements in the film. I just worked on a sound sculpture for the first time, so it had like no imagery. Well, it was of these oysters, so it was a recognizable thing, but it was not image based. And for that, I wrote a 5-part synthetic choir piece based on a chant of the wives of pearl divers, because the Gulf, that their economy before oil was pearl diving and fishing. And that was really fun because it was thinking about sound a lot more spatially rather than to like accompany something. And the sound really is part of the physical, area, the physical mindset that you enter when you're in the middle of all these oysters. So yeah, that's kind of how I've worked with it until now.
I think sound varies. For me, I don't know, I feel like it's such a visceral thing. I love the way that like sound enters the body. I love seeing the way I love a good screening, and I love sound just by itself. And I think that it can be like one of the most physical, like visceral experiences I've had when I'm like encountering like works in different ways. But I also I think it's also related to this idea of translation. I do make video work as well, and sound plays a big part of that. A lot of the times I leave the video work in Creole, and so I'm leaving that as like one thing for a specific audience as well. And so I think I use sound as a way of like, I don't know, keeping certain things private but from certain people, but also like giving access to different people. And so I do think that I play around with like in terms of like the hierarchy of access, but in terms of like the language that the sound plays in. But I think for me, ultimately, I like the idea of like the sound entering the body in different ways.
Thank you both so much.
The next question is from me, and I have sort of 2 questions. One is about the group show. I'm sure every show, every installation reveals something new about your work, and I was wondering if there's something new from this group show, seeing your work with the two other artists, are there any sort of anything new that you discovered about your work or about photography? And then my second question, Farah, you mentioned earlier about photography as a means to preserve time, and I feel like that's kind of like a through line in all of your practices. And I wanted to ask whether this sort of decision to preserve or like this memory or history that you want to preserve change over the process of your making. So when you're photographing something, like you have an idea of what you want to preserve, but does that ever change as you start editing and printing and think about the exhibition and where it will be shown? Those are my two questions.
So I guess I will start. I think that for me, um, like really thinking about like all the works that are in the show and all the artists that are in the show, and like really thinking about the through line of the show. And for me, it's like this, like our relationship to memory. I know that within you talked about this very much so, but I really think about like that body of work and like how that body of work came to be and from where it came to be. And it is really like my relationship to my grandmother's memory. That's how that work came to be. And yeah, just like reflecting on that. And then yeah, I think that I'm also in like the presence of like really amazing artists too, right? So like thinking about Farah, Widline, and John, who's not here. Just like being in their presence and like having our works um uh like communicate with each other, and the way in which the works are able to like talk to each other, I think for me is exciting and like new for me. So
I would say, I don't know, I think having work in the show and company with like Farah, Pa, John, and Guadalupe, just I think seeing the ways that they're making work, and thinking about some of the things that I'm interested in, but like capturing them in different ways that I'm like amazed by. I think that's been like the thing that I've discovered throughout like the run of the show and throughout seeing our work in the same space together. I like this idea of seeing, I don't know. I wasn't sure how the show was going to turn out because, you get an idea, you get like asked to do a show, and you're like, I don't know. It's not that I was doubting, but I think it's just like seeing something physically come to life versus the idea itself is very different. But I was really happy to just see, yeah, the different through lines that we're thinking about manifesting across like various subjects and various ways of like capturing and imaging and like bringing things to life. What was your second question, man?
It's sort of reflecting back on what Farah said earlier about photography as a means to like preserve time and whether your sort of photography like process reveals something new like in the process. So you might have an idea of what you would like to preserve and memories you would like to present. And then does that ever change what as you take the photographs, but also like edit and print and like throughout your practice or throughout your process?
Oh, for sure. I think it would be a problem if it didn't change, to be honest, at this point. Everything changes. Like, I think the idea starts in my mind, but then like the closer I get to making it, like physically, the more it changes. And I feel like one of the things that I've had to like give up on is this idea that like everything that I see in my mind will match what I make. It doesn't. sometimes for the best. And I think I've just learned to live with that. But then I think also like after I like shoot, I like to just like give myself a few days before I look at the images because I think again, even after I've made the work, the process of time changes my perception of it. So like I might like as I'm shooting have like one favorite image and I'm like, oh, this is gonna be the one that I'm like, okay, this is what I'm showing from this shoot. But then like I give myself like 5 days, I change my mind. I give myself another month, I change my mind. I think the meanings start to change. And that can happen like as I'm making other work, or it can happen just like as I don't know, as I don't know, as time passes, or as I've had like accumulated different experience, or as like the initial idea changes in my mind after I've made the work too.
Yeah, I was gonna say to answer that, I religiously go back through my hard drives every couple of weeks, and sometimes I'll photograph a building and think it's not important, and then the building will disappear, and then suddenly it does become my photograph of it becomes important because that thing no longer exists. So I think we don't always know the significance of what we're doing until we've spent a little bit of time with it, and also time transforms the photographs. And then I think for your first question about seeing everybody together in a group show, it's just really it's interesting to be placed in a group show with other photographers because it makes me think about like even though everybody's different, it makes me think about where we're at this moment in time with the medium. And I keep thinking about the matter of like subject and what subject even means, where you can no longer say like, okay, Ansel Adams was taking photographs of the American West, Helen Levitt was taking photographs of New York City street life. I don't know, like Dorothy Lang and Walker Evans were part of the FSA taking photographs of, rural America. And of course, these are all people who are also maybe considered in some sense documentarians, maybe except for Ansel Adams. But I think that there's been a shift just a natural shift over time with the medium where the idea of a clear subject is less important and that it becomes more of a reflection of whatever experience the artist has that they're trying to share with you. And yeah, I think that always for me, like I asked a lot of questions about art as photography as art versus as document or as witness. Um, and yeah, that's what's interesting to me about the show is that I don't think any of us is working with a very easily identifiable subject, but I think that's what's so interesting about it.
Thank you. And our last question is going to come from Fun.
Thank you, Min. Thank you so much, you all. It's fantastic. I'm sorry I missed a little bit here and there, caught up in phone call, but I'm dying to see the show. And I heard you spoken to Chloe back and forth, and I know some of your work. And it just occurred to me that there's a sense of portraiture in all the works, where there's a frontality of a motif, street at night with the light, and of course your portrait of your family, Pao. And I can't just help to think that the idea of the labor, the image, the dignity of the image, which, believe it or not, of all the great exhibition at the Modern Museum, the most highly anticipated, still remain to be the best show ever, was 1955, The Family of Man. And it's interesting because how dignity of work is now being not as appreciated fully, being looked down upon. And I know that looking at those images of all these amazing photographers we know of, whether Levitt or Ansel Adams, whether Gore Sandberg, Robert Frank, August Sanders, and these people. Even Dorothy Land, thinking of her image of the very incredibly poor woman and sitting in the front porch, that it was was taken during Depression, most hot time, but there was a sense of dignity of her present. that is not as preserved so much where we are now culturally in the last 2-3 decades, you know? So my question is that, do you think about the dignity of the image? Because it appeared to me there's sense of portraiture, the long meditation of those images that you have taken, you know? It's a lot of contemplation there, premeditation there, I would say. Is that a fair question to ask you guys? Well, we start with you, Pao, from the image of the person to the object and the street.
Yeah, so I do. I think about that a lot. And I would say that um I often say that I have a really like traditional like photographic upbringing. And what I mean by that is in my undergrad, I was taught by professors, who like worked in the dark room, who had 4x5s, who studied the canons of photographer. And then I went to Yale for my MFA, and I was taught by Todd Papageorge, and then Gregory Crutzen, and had a host of really amazing critics that came through the panel, who in some sense like really loved like the traditions of like photography. And so I was like, I often say that I come from this really like traditional upbringing in photography, and portraiture is something that I love. I studied August Sander like greatly. I live in Minnesota, and Alex Soth is in Minnesota, and the way in which he's like revolutionized, I think, contemporary photography and portraiture. Like there's a whole host of that, and so I think about it a lot. I think about the family albums that I have. I think a lot about in the refugee camps in Thailand, there would be people that would come in and would make portraits for you because they know that there would be the separation of families. And so like the way in which like the portrait like has lived with me and in my family has been like very much of that of importance. And so yeah, I mean, I think about it a lot in my work. I love that Farah was talking about this portrait that she made, and she like lovingly called it the portrait of her mother, right? And I think about like the ways in which my family like has allowed me to photograph them, and for them to not know like why I'm making the portraits, or like what they're for, right? Or how they will exist like outside of our family. And so yeah, that for me is like really, really important. I give a story. So in 2022, I was part of the Whitney Biennial, and I had some portraits that were in the Whitney Biennial. And my mother, for the first time in her whole entire life, decided that she was going to come to New York and go see the works in the Whitney Biennial. And she went and she saw the portraits, and I kid you not, like she asked me, why would you choose those portraits? They're horrible portraits. And why are you not like, why would you choose these portraits, right? And so I think that like I think a lot about how my family consumes like portraiture, and then how I have historically consumed them, how I'm taught to consume them, and like the kind of privileges that I have that my parents don't have, that my siblings don't have, that my community don't have, in thinking about like portraiture and like the history of portraiture.
What were your response? How did you respond to your moms?
Oh, I just, I mean, it's like every mother, you're just like, you're like, well, like these are the works. But and that's oftentimes like the criticism that I get back, or like the not knowing, like my mother doesn't know that I'm an artist. She knows that I teach at a university, but she doesn't know that I'm an artist, and and I don't think she will understand what an artist is. And I think that that's just like, like I feel like I'm in a very privileged position in that I get to study the art. I get to, like, the art making is very much part of my practice. And, I feel like I'm in a very privileged position. And whereas my mother is not, because she didn't have the luxury of studying art. And, she doesn't have the luxury of like learning and being able to read, and so yeah, I feel immensely privileged. And then also, like, I'm always thinking about yeah, like my history and where I come from, and like the relationship to portraiture is really, really important for me.
Mhm. Okay, well, no apology to being classical or traditional. There's no need to do that. What about you guys briefly? I mean, otherwise, thank you. It's been, I need to go back and re-listen from the beginning. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Can't wait to see the show. Back to you, Min.
Thank you, Bong. Pao, do you want to give an introduction to the music video that we're about to play?
Okay, so I'm really excited about this music video. Yesterday, Min said that there would be some time at the end for us to share something, and it could be anything. And so this is a music video from a Hmong woman in Thailand, and I think she's like amazingly radical. She doesn't realize that she's like a feminist, but she makes music videos that are oftentimes like the Hmong community would deem weird and unusual. And this is in the way in which like she transitions her lyrics, and the way in which she like the music that she makes, right? So she makes all of this, in like her clothing decisions, in her dancing decisions. But oftentimes the music that she makes is very much about like being empowered as a woman, and not like needing a man to like survive. And so this song, her name is Gausi Zhang, and she sings with her sister, whose name is Lo Zhang, and they are this duo, and they made music from 2014 all the way up to 2019. I believe that she stopped making music because she got married. And so, but this is like one of like the most like radical like music videos from a Hmong person that I have like ever seen. And so I think we're gonna play like a minute of it. And so the title of the song is Chito Vika, and what it translates to is I'm not gonna die because of you. And it's for a man.
Oh my God, Louis God, Dayu Mom, Chuango Day, George, hey, yeah, oh. Ui chúa chỉ cơ vì có nu nó của tao đi có u thiên lý xa lòng lo hào có dạo hào chúa nâng xiên hào nọ
yeah, I love them so much. So
Thank you. Thank you, Farah, Widline, Pao, and Chloe for today's conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Kyle from Peter Boom Gallery, for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Farah Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on world poetry with Katie Long, James Loop, Alice Yang, Matvey Yankelevich, and Colt Swenson. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and thank you and goodbye. As you leave.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Go see this show if you're in New York, please.
Congratulations, you all.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.